In the year between October 2012 and September 2013, New York City's Department of Correction handed over 3,047 people to federal immigration agents. During that period, 1,163 of those so-called detainer requests were denied. Okay. And if the City Council passes a new law that's expected to come up for a vote soon, the number of requests denied would rise dramatically. This new hand them over, not so fast policy would put us on par with some other large American cities like Philadelphia, Chicago, and Los Angeles.
Now, ICE is the acronym for the United States government's Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, the authorities responsible for detaining and deporting thousands of immigrants. Is New York City about to stop playing nice with ICE? And what do supporters of the legislation hope it'll achieve? And how do the federal government's concerns get answered? We want to welcome back City Council Member Carlos Menchaca of Brooklyn's 38th District. Good to see you again, Councilmember.
Thanks for having me today.
Absolutely. And we are also happy to join with Marika Diaz, who's the managing attorney of Make the Road New York. Welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
And Joan Gibbs, the General Counsel for the Center for Law and Social Justice at Medgar Evers College, as well as the project director for the college's Immigration Center. Thanks for joining us again.
Thanks for inviting me.
All right.
All right, so let's start with municipal IDs. When are they going to be, when is the rollout going to begin, and who's going to be eligible to get one?
So one of the great things about the municipal identification card and just how you entered the conversation about detainers, we're talking about how we bring the immigrant populations in all our boroughs out of the shadows. And so every New Yorker, if you're a resident, and you can prove your residency and your identity, can get a card, no matter immigration status. These cards will be coming out in January of next year, and the administration just had their mandatory public hearing last week, in which they brought some of these rules that we've been creating to the public to get comments. And so this is all part of the process.
Okay. So I want a municipal ID. Where do I go to sign up for one? How does that work, and what are practical ways that I could use it?
So a lot of this is still being generated, but one of the things that we and when I say we, this is a collaboration coalition with all the advocates and a lot of the residents that helped us create this piece of legislation. We are looking at mobile sites where we can go into communities like Sunset Park, so that we won't have the kind of DMV experience where people are only going to go to 2 or 3 spaces in the city, but looking at government buildings. We're looking at locations in churches where we can come in for a week and do a lot of outreach the month before to make sure that people know that they can come in. This is going to require a lot of technology that's being procured right now. And so those details will be hammered out soon, but by January we'll have a good outreach plan that makes sure that everybody in the 5 boroughs will be able to walk to a neighborhood location to get their ID.
So Marika and Joan, those are the intentions and what's being hammered out right now, and they're going to be knocking on your door. They already have, but they're going to be knocking a little louder so you can help with getting people out. So what are some of the concerns or the voices that you're hearing as you guys are on the ground with folks who might be in line?
I mean, so Make the Road New York is an organisation that serves low-income immigrants, and there's plenty of excitement in our communities and the communities that we work with about the municipal ID, because for folks who are undocumented in particular, it really is a way for folks to have an identification that they can use when they interact with different agencies and authorities. So it is a way of bringing people out of the shadows and creating an equality amongst New Yorkers, which exists, but perhaps not in the paper form. And so this is really, speaking to that and creating a document that actually, shows what we're about in New York City. So there's plenty of excitement, and we envisage that there'll be, tons of people signing up for this.
Okay.
Well, I have to say that for us, we of course support making ID available to immigrants and to other people in New York City who might not have ID. There are a lot of people here without ID. Right. However, we do have some concerns about whether or not the possession of these IDs will become mandatory in instances. That comes from my own and others' experience with working against apartheid and the memory of having people have.
So this is like a show me your papers fear kind of thing?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, as an immigrant, I know that there are people who want to stay in the shadows, and they're
Right.
concerned as an undocumented person how that information may be used against them going forward. And, Mr. Menchaca, maybe you can speak to that a little bit, because there's always a level of skepticism and cynicism that comes along with it, like, oh, ID, you want to know my address, and, how are we going to overcome those challenges?
I think this has been something that's been a strong sentiment since the beginning of the concept, and this is not something we created just this year. This has been something that the advocates have been thinking about, like Make the Road, for this kind of skepticism. So what we need to really understand here is that this is going to really bring people out of the shadows for the reasons they want to come out for the shadows. They're going to want to go and interact with their local schools, for example, parents dropping off kids, being part of PTAs. An ID is required for entering government buildings like schools. We want our immigrant population, and anybody really, like we said, this isn't just for immigrants, this is for the elderly, the LGBT community, the transgender community specifically, so that they can interact with police force, to be able to report crimes and have a positive relationship with our police. So many of our communities are erupting right now in a lack of mutual disrespect. These things are going to help heal that relationship and offer something that wasn't there before. So this isn't a show me your papers situation. This is an option that is not available now, and in January will become available.
And to be clear, it's not the immigrant card. Like,
Right.
I have every intention of showing up to get the card. I have a municipal ID. I don't have to carry my driver's license that I don't need on my bike or on the train everywhere. And there's also other benefits tied to the card. But I wondered, you guys threw open the doors and had hearings. What were some of the arguments coming in to say, you know what, not so fast. We don't need this. And not just from people who might be undocumented, but people who are proud to tell you their lineage and history of legally coming to America, which is what we hear a lot.
Well, and I'll start the conversation, but I want to make sure that Marika can kind of talk a little bit about some of the things that they're hearing at the Make the Road and other organizations. But I think there's issues around cost. I think there's issues around terrorism and how this is going to not allow for us to be able to do the work that we need to do on enforcement. And none of this is preventing us from continuing to do the work on that front. This is going to make our communities safer. Like we said, we're gonna have more people interacting with law enforcement. That's what we are lacking right now, and this is what we can help address.
Okay.
And I think, you're right to raise that question of people's feelings of concern about how information will be used and whether it creates any risk for them. And with that in mind, community agencies were very much involved, as the council member has said, in the process of drafting the legislation. And so there are protections in there in terms of how information can and can't be shared, who it can and can't be shared with, and under what circumstances. And those are really a critical part of that legislation that introduces the ID. And so those things are there and in place to protect people. But in addition to that, I think one of the things that we've really focused on is what will people be required to produce, what kind of documentation will they need to provide to get the ID. And so that's been certainly a focal point for us, because we do work with a lot of undocumented immigrants who sometimes don't have a lot of paperwork to demonstrate their residency or their identity and things like that. And so that has really been a focus of ours, of trying to make sure that this is really accessible to everyone, both documented and undocumented people.
Well, I'd like to add, though, that I think it has to be, the role has to be accompanied by a massive education campaign to educate people about the ID, how it's going to be, the information on all of that. And I say that because our office did, for the last census, we did an outreach and education campaign. And the numbers of people who refused to fill out their census form. And the census form requires almost no information. I mean, I'm sure you know that because you looked at it.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And it was, and it was really, the number of people in New York City was really pretty low,
And that's an important piece.
And that's why, we have some concerns. And then also, we were involved in when, after 9/11, and when the requirement that certain immigrants, had to register, right? And some of the you know, the blowback from that, I mean, I was reading yesterday, I was reading some information about that. And some of the people who honestly and legitimately went to register got caught up in the system. So we just like have to bring, you know, we have to look at it in historical and kind of
and there's no doubt that the system is broken, and we're waiting for federal government to bring those reforms, but we're not. Or I should say, we're not waiting for them, and we're taking action. And so everything we've just discussed, this is a municipal program. This database is just within New York City. There's judicial warrants that are going to be required for any enforcement or any agency to access this data. This data is essentially locked. What we also need to remember is that we're going to get reports every time someone goes in with a judicial warrant. We're going to see that at a quarterly basis. We're going to monitor this, and this is for the next 2 years. And so we'll make some more decisions at the 2-year mark whether or not this is a database that is compromised. We'll know that very, very soon. So those are the things that I think are alerting. These are flags for people, but we've built it so that we bring the best kind of security for this database and all the museums, the 30+ museums, including the Botanic Garden in Brooklyn, the Brooklyn Museum, and others that people are going to have access to. And for our communities, like our low-income communities, they're going to be awesome opportunities for us to really experience New York for what it's worth, to get into our schools and into our museums.
So I'm sorry, you mentioned the low cost, bringing down the price of admission for some of these institutions and great cultural gyms, but how much is it going to cost us on the front end? Is it like $5, $10? A driver's license isn't cheap.
These cards are for free. So this first year, we want as many people to get these cards, which is why we're eliminating the fee. And the fee for this first year entrance into the museums and cultural institutions is also going to be free.
Okay, so one quick question, because I know that this is, as I'm thinking it through, how is this municipal ID going to differ from a non-driver's ID? What's the difference?
There are a couple differences. One is the non-driver's ID is a state ID that has its own complications that you probably already experienced well, and our viewers out there experience and can kind of let us know exactly what those issues are. But it's also, the Muni ID is a municipal identification. Outside the borders of the city, it will be invalid. And the municipal ID cannot be used for travel. So this is really within the confines of this city.
So who's paying for the free ID then, since it's not a front-ended thing?
The City of New York has already allocated the necessary resources to create the technology, to create the process, to hire the people.
Is there a number attached to that yet?
We'll know very soon as far as we get to open date. But I believe the number is around $8 million that was currently put in for the kind of prep work that's needed.
Okay, all right, so moving on.
Yeah, a minute ago you opened the door saying New York City was doing the work that the federal government can't seem to get their act together to do some real comprehensive immigration reform, or even rubber stamp immigration reform. So we're going to move on now to that thing, Detainers.
Detainers. All right, so from what we understand, New York City is going to limit their cooperation with the federal government in terms of handing over undocumented immigrants, just like, oh, you stole a candy bar, here you go, to ICE. Wow, like how is that going to impact New York? And are we kind of behind the curve, or are we getting ahead of the curve?
Well, I'll first start with some history. The Speaker of the City Council, Melissa Mark Viverito, back in 2011 and 2013 introduced 2 pieces of legislation that started attacking this. We had a different mayor at the time, a different city council, and so essentially these were watered down. Now this immigration committee has been very, very, and as chair of the immigration committee, we've been very excited about really setting the ground for an ecosystem of experience with our immigrants, and not just undocumented, but all immigrants, and figuring out how we could create better relationship with our government agencies, including the NYPD, as we just talked about with Muni ID. And so what we've done with the Detainers, and there's 2 pieces of legislation that are changing what NYPD does and the Department of Correction does. And it really limits the cooperation with ICE. It forces a judicial warrant, similar like we talked about with Muni IDs. There's going to have to be probable cause for anyone to want to honor a detainer at this point.
From a federal judge.
From a federal judge. And so what we're asking these two institutions, NYPD and DOC, is to really limit the number of detainers that we honor. So not only do you need a judicial warrant, but you're also going to need a short list of serious violent felonies within the last 5 years.
Okay, so
to the lawyers.
right. How does
Is this legal? Number one, is the city going to get into trouble from the feds? Are we going to lose some funding or something over this?
Right.
And what is that chain of, okay, you're arrested and you somehow get into the criminal justice system?
Right.
How does
what's that
ICE get
process? Like
involved?
it's
So I suppose to begin, maybe,
right.
you know, as Councilmember has mentioned, we have seen two waves of legislation in the last few years that have increasingly limited the city's cooperation with ICE.
Right.
And so basically what happens is, you know, in May of 2012, the program Secure Communities was rolled out. And so what that is a fingerprint matching program. It's a fingerprint matching system. And New York City was basically co-opted into it at that time. And what that means is that when someone comes in contact with law enforcement, whether it's NYPD or then later on with Department of Corrections, there are various points at which their fingerprints will be shared with immigration.
okay.
And so what that means is that someone can be potentially arrested by the police, fingerprinted, maybe never charged with anything, ultimately.
But your prints are there.
But the prints are there and they get shared. And then what happens is that ICE will look at that person and decide whether they want to issue what's called a detainer or not. And when they issue a detainer, which they predominantly do for people who have pending criminal charges, prior criminal charges, terrorism screening kind of matches, or even just old orders of removal, so old deportation orders. And that's a big dragnet. That catches a lot of people. So what will happen is they will then issue a detainer to local law enforcement. So if the person is still with NYPD, that will go to NYPD. But then if the person is passing through the system, let's say they get arraigned and they're then ending up in Department of Corrections custody, perhaps at Rikers or another metropolitan facility, the detainer will go to Department of Corrections. The detainer is basically a request. It asks the local law enforcement agency to hold that person for 48 hours beyond the time that they would have otherwise been released.
Released, okay.
Exactly. So let's say that person goes before a judge in criminal court, bail is set, maybe it's even just dollar bail, right? And so that ordinarily that person's family would come in, pay $1, that person would walk out the door. And you know, they'd be dealing with their criminal case after that. But what happens is for immigrants who have detainers placed on them, nobody can pay that bail because if someone pays that bail, the person is immediately, within that 48 period, handed over to ICE. They don't walk out the door. And so what that does is it means that many, many immigrants, and you know, you described the numbers earlier on as, you know, over 3,000, get caught up in this dragnet, where even for the most minor violations, they can end up being, you know, going through that pipeline into immigration custody. And so that's really sort of basically how the process works.
I like to say, you know, I think that the limitation on the honoring of detainers and removal of people from Rikers is a real important step, right? But one of the things that, you know, I think about immigration issues a lot, and I think one of the things, though, is that I have to keep asking myself, well, will the ICE go into the community? Because this does not prohibit entirely. It's not a prohibition entirely.
It's just the city saying, we're not going to hand over, but they can still...
They can still knock on your door, and there's other entry and other places that that they could go to. So what we would like to see is a prohibition by a law by the city which prohibits
ICE from interacting
with any of the city agencies and institutions.
Oh, so
what would
if
be
we
an
don't get you at
example?
jail, we'll get you at
where?
welfare
Probation
office or
office or something.
Okay.
That's And that's
Which is, it's important.
That's what we would like to see. I mean, in reality, what we would like to see is an ICE-free city, but we know we're not going to.
Okay.
But we would like to
Although I
push for
would
it.
say on that point, Department of Probation did announce just in the last week that they will be
not gonna
stopping their cooperation with ICE. And so that's an amazing development. And gradually what we're seeing is, city agencies one by one
Right.
effectively shutting the door to ICE and saying,
So
well, we're not
why
going to
are we making the city more safe for criminals, giving them safeguards instead of protecting our own citizens? Is the voice
I
that's
think
going to
that's
come
a
back?
leap,
That's good.
Brian. That's
Yeah.
a real leap that we're
But
talking
listen,
about.
if they
what a lot
were
of
in
conservative
jail,
voices are gonna say.
if it's a leap, it's like this. Because if they were
So
in jail,
let's just
then
step back a little bit because this is
Take us
what
back.
we're fighting.
Yeah.
The sentiment that anybody that gets caught up in the criminal justice system
Right.
is a criminal. There's due process here that is not being enforced here. The fact that detainers come in sometimes remove people from within their process to
As they're in
get
the
to
Before
get
they've
arraigned.
completed the due process.
We need to make sure that a couple things that are said. Most of the people that are being detained are for riding your bike on a sidewalk.
Yeah.
These are non-serious issues that are getting picked up, or not having an ID, and you get pulled in, you get fingerprinted into to the precinct. Which is why all these pieces, the Muni ID, the detainer piece, I don't know if we've spoken about the Knife Up program, the New York Immigrant Family Unity Project, where we're now bringing public defenders to defend New Yorkers who are going through deportation proceedings. Because if they have a lawyer, they have a greater chance of returning back to their homes.
Yep.
These are not criminals. And so the people who are criminals, that have violent felony convictions, those detainers will make sense.
Yeah, well, what are the guidelines for this? Who decides what's
Which
something
is to
violent
say-
and what's not?
But before we get to that,
very
can I say,
subjective.
and as a given, we'll lay the ground rule and say they're not criminals. Even if we take that as a blanket statement, they're
Everyone
not
is innocent
criminals.
until proven guilty.
They're not criminals, but they're not citizens. So they're enjoying the same rights and privileges of a U.S. citizen to that presumption of innocence. But there are people who are watching this right now saying that's all fine and well if you're an American. But if you're not an American, why should you have rights and privileges that I do? If you ride your bike on the sidewalk and you're not one of us, bye. If you sell the drugs, bye. We have enough problems to deal with, and we're spending our money defending people who aren't even from this country. That's the argument.
That is going to be the
That's
argument.
what we
I
hear
agree
at
with
the
that,
kitchen
but
table in the
I'd
water
like to
cooler.
say that let's step back and look at this sort of in a historical context. All of these problems arise from the 1996 Immigration So-Called Reform Act, which lengthened the length of crimes that you could be deported for. So we really need to keep pushing for comprehensive immigration reform, and particularly to eliminate that, because there's absolutely no reason why somebody who,
A minor quality of life infraction.
minor quality, but somebody who committed a crime
Should be in the same
35
way.
years ago
Yes,
or
we
20
were-
years ago
right.
should be subject to deportation now.
Yes.
Right.
And so-
that's
and
exactly
that's the
who's
kind-
being
that.
deported right now.
Yeah.
Right, and that's what I think that we have to begin to think about and work on. And that when the city looks at these detainers, I hope they will give some attention to the age of the crime that's being.
But that's
the
not
person-
currently happening.
That's
as
not
we know.
currently happening.
We know
this
that that's
law-
not currently
This law
happening.
defines it as such. So this
Okay.
is a 5-year. There's a 5-year now
Okay.
requirement for all felonies, and it kind of really addresses that one issue. And we have to kind of think about what we're doing here when we're pulling one person out of a community for a minor infraction, and they end up in immigration detention for 8 to 10. The average is 73 days that we're pulling someone from a community. They might have been a small business owner, and so our immigrants. I mean, you're talking about who these people are. These are people who are in our PTAs, have leadership positions in our PTAs. There are small business owners. They are workers in our restaurants. These are people who are integral into our community. And so for us, we're not defining people's status is not defining people's value in our city, in New York City. If you're a resident in New York City, you should have every access to everything that we provide. Period.
Yeah, we can even talk about quality of life infractions and talk about even within all of our citizens who gets, pulled over and stopped and frisked and dealt with more harshly than others. So we can go into even more
It's
than
the
that.
same population.
It's the same population. Now we're running out of time, but what do you guys see happening next to make the process more fair for undocumented immigrants?
We have,
What's
in the
the next
last
step?
9 months, with this immigration committee and with this city council speaker, have laid the groundwork in coalition with these organizations that have been thinking about this for such a long time. The next step is really kind of making this education campaign that now this city, in the first year of this new government, has offered a new experience. And so the next step is really kind of crafting that educational experience that all our nonprofits on the ground, our churches, our small businesses are offering a different tone, a different message. And that's what we're doing right now.
Okay, and anyone over here want to give some last words?
You've
What
got
do you
30
hope? 30 seconds. What you
15
hope
of
is
them are
going to?
yours.
Look, I mean, we really hope that this legislation passes. It's going to make a huge difference for the immigrant populations that we work with. It will go a very long way to keeping New York families together. We see a lot of families being torn apart because of the city's cooperation with ICE, and we really want to see that end. And, it's going to go a long way to saving the city some money. At the moment, the city is footing the bill for these extra 73 days that people are spending in custody as a result of this. And so, really it's a win-win situation all round.
Okay, and Joan?
We are looking forward to see that that the agencies and other institutions that are not mandated pursuant to this legislation be included within it, such as probation, and we're looking to see what kind of education campaign that's brought so that people, because we're concerned about, the poor and homeless people too. I mean, who we don't talk about. We do talk about people working and stuff, but there are also a lot of immigrants that come to our office actually are living in homeless shelters. So.
Okay, well, this is a hot topic, and it's still early in the game. We will be keeping an eye on this, and I'm sure talking with you guys again soon. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.